Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today for this eighth installment of Suburban Diagnostics Knowledge Spree series of webinars. My name is Dr. Vinit Nair, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Today, we have lined up two sessions to provide insights into the clinical evaluation and lab diagnosis of monsoon fevers, a very relevant and critical topic today. During this raging pandemic, we all have to know how to approach our usual monsoon fevers. I would like to remind everyone that our webinars are intended to be as interactive as possible, and we encourage you to actively participate. Submit as many questions as you like at any time you want during the webinar. To submit your question, simply type the question into the chat box to your right and click send. We will have a consolidated Q&A session with both speakers towards the end of the presentation. If you have any trouble seeing or hearing the presentation, please use the chat box to let us know. Please note, with this webinar, we will be giving certificates of attendance. All those who complete the webinars and wish to be provided with certificates must fill a form which we will provide to you at the end of the webinars. This form will only ask you for your email as well as your name and title as you want it to appear on the certificate. Only those who fill out the form will be provided the certificate. I would now like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Vikrant Shah. He's a senior physician, intensivist, and infectious disease specialist at Zen Hospital and Joy Hospital. Aside from his clinical skills, he's a dynamic orator who's spoken in multiple training programs and web telecasts. He is famous for his weekly CMEs for general practitioners, focusing on various topics of interest in general practice. Newer developments in treating HIV infections, nosocomial infections in geriatric age groups, and advanced diabetes management are his areas of interest. Without further ado, let me hand over the reins of this webinar to Dr. Shah. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Vinit, for this warm introduction, and thank you, Team Suburban, for making this platform available for all of us to interact with each other in this lockdown. We've been really facing big time problem with this COVID pandemic, and I've been given a topic of monsoon illnesses and COVID-19, a challenge to manage. So essentially, I'll not be talking about monsoon illnesses. All of us are practicing doctors and we are aware about malaria, dengue, typhoid, and so on and so forth, all the monsoon related illnesses. What is the challenge to face is now with monsoon coming in, expecting this monsoon illnesses and simultaneously COVID-19 going on, what are the different challenges and how do we overcome? So a small attempt which I've made to discuss amongst you all. So, Dr. Vinit, I can't see my slide properly. It's coming as highlight. Right. So this is what is the common picture we see everywhere. Right. What you can see on the left is monsoon and its problems, and on the right you can see this dynamic COVID, which is causing a big time problem. What are the most commonest monsoon illnesses? What we see is malaria, dengue, enteric fever. We no longer call it as typhoid fever anymore. Chikungunya, viral hepatitis, gastroenteritis, viral encephalitis. Now, what is today's agenda? How are we going to manage these monsoon illnesses in COVID-19? So what are the different challenges? Now that disease is in the community, no longer we're going to really be depending upon any history of travel or any contact who had a travel. That's not really relevant. It's in the community and we're seeing the numbers are really going on to peak every single day. In past, we've seen more than one infection in one patient at the same time. For example, we have seen malaria and dengue. We have seen gastroenteritis with enteric fever. So that is a co-infection. On presentation, how are we going to differentiate between acute bronchitis or bronchial asthma or acute exacerbation of chronic bronchitis? Or there is an early ARDS secondary to COVID-19 or COVID pneumonia, or for that matter, ARDS secondary to malaria, dengue, leptospira. All these complicated illnesses, when it affects lung, you can have a lung injury, you can have ARDS. So that's going to be a difficult challenge. About 18% of the COVID-19 patients were aware that they present with GI symptoms alone without any fever, cough, cold, throat pain. They can have just diarrhea, they can have malaise, they can have body ache. So this is going to be a challenge since so many co-infection can exist together. How are we going to go about it? Now there's something called a sine qua non feature, which is one of the important line which I remember reading in Harrison, which is Bible for all our practicing doctors who have read medicine. So what it says, there are certain specific features for specific illnesses. Like for example, we see bone breaking fever in dengue. People say that my pain is so bad that I can experience the pain going up to the bones. There's a significant high fever, conjunctival suffusion, and calf tenderness. This is, we call it as sine qua non feature for leptospirosis. This is the significant triad which we've been remembering as a medical student, and now there are severe rigors in malaria. So people generally say, the layman's language, that I've taken 3-4 blankets all together and I was still shivering within the blanket. So that's classical of malaria, what we generally see. Obviously, such kind of chills and rigor we can also see in severe urine infection, pyelonephritis. There is some pus somewhere in the body, what we call it as occult infection. There's a step ladder pattern of fever in enteric fever. We've been taught the different types of fever: continuous fever, intermittent fever, remittent fever. So intermittent fever could be tertian fever, quotidian fever, so something like that. Tertian fever we see in malaria, so you get fever on day 1, you get fever on day 3. Quotidian fever is seen in Plasmodium malariae. We have significant arthralgia, rash, and there is a typical posture, what we call it as contorted posture in chikungunya. You can actually see that the patient who's suffering with chikungunya is bending and trying to walk, and you can see that grimace and the agony on his face, his or her face, because of the excruciating pains. The jaundice is seen in viral hepatitis. Jaundice could be seen in other monsoon-related illnesses. You can see jaundice in malaria. You can see jaundice in dengue. You can see the jaundice in enteric fever. Obviously, the pathophysiology is different. What we see in dengue and malaria is what we call it as hepatopathy. There are loose motions seen in gastroenteritis, one of the typical presentation for gastroenteritis. But it's not enough. Just the sine qua non features are not enough. So we need to go back to our basics. So what is important? What has been taught in first MBBS, and thereafter it has been just imbibed on your mind that to be a good clinician, you should be a good doctor, which makes it possible only if you're good at history taking and you're extremely good at your clinical examination. So history of patient helps us differentiate. So history of positive contact with COVID will increase the suspicion. But how about contacts with asymptomatic carrier? There are so many asymptomatic carriers which are roaming around all over the place right now. For patients presenting with dyspnea, past history is definitely important, but will not rule out COVID-19. If somebody is known case of bronchial asthma, known case of bronchitis, known case of COPD, he or she cannot get COVID-19? No, not possible. They can be infected with COVID-19. In fact, they will have a more disastrous course. Patient presenting with fever with chills, malaria should be suspected, may be suspected. Again, we have to suspect UTI, you have to suspect some pus. But COVID-19 patient can also have fever with minimal shivering. You must have heard over a period of time now that every evening I feel chills or I get rigors. This is the commonest history we see from COVID-19 patients these days. Patients with GI symptoms, most likely GI infection if they have history of eating or drinking outside, contaminated food, contaminated water. But as I said earlier, 18% of COVID patients can present with only GI symptoms with no respiratory symptoms. Drowsiness can be seen in COVID-19, but that's going to be a differential diagnosis for viral encephalitis we see as a part of monsoon-related illness. How do we get this from here? So up till now, in my earlier slides, what I have narrated is what are the commonest monsoon-related illnesses and what are the difficulties which we're going to face vis-a-vis the clinical symptoms. And even if we take a detailed history, it's going to be a problem because history can mimic each other, and we are aware that we can have co-infection, we can have two infections together. So how do we get this from here? Answer is still same, which is age-old. Extremely good history taking, thorough clinical examination, spending good time with patient. Then after doing this, we're going to have a working diagnosis in mind. And to confirm our working diagnosis, to prove that you're right, we need to take help of investigations and treat it accordingly. So if it is so very simple, why am I having this presentation? Why have I taken this topic? What is so difficult? So there is a problem. All of us would agree what I've mentioned in the previous slide is just the truth, but it's not possible in the current scenario. And that is the challenge. We're going to have 10 to 15 minutes consult with a patient. How do we take a detailed history? How do we have a thorough clinical examination? How do we look into a detailed investigations done? And how do we give the prescription in 10 to 15 minutes time? Why am I saying 10 to 15 minutes? Because the viral exposure time more than half an hour with one patient is going to be a problem if he or she is suffering from COVID or they are asymptomatic carrier. You're going to be sitting in your room and you're going to be exposed for a long time. Your risk of acquiring the infection is very high. So we're going to limit our OPD timings to 10 to 15 minutes per patient. So doing all those things what we just discussed is going to be difficult. So is thorough clinical examination possible without touching the patient? That's again a problem. So we're not really helping ourselves or patient, and I'm sure all of y'all like me are not clinically satisfied, not touching the patient, not examining the patient, not using your stethoscope the way you would normally use it before the COVID emerged, and seeing patients sitting 6 feet apart. So it's going to be a challenge. Obviously, we are overcoming the problem. We are coming up with a Bluetooth stethoscope and so many things which we are changing now, but still it's a big challenge. So also, even if we do this with due risk, there are technical problems. So when it comes to temperature, reliability of the infrared thermometer. Now, since March, all of us are using infrared thermometer, and we've seen it takes basically the temperature which is the ambient temperature. So if somebody is sitting in the AC room, it's not going to pick up accurately. If somebody is coming in a deep sunlight with a maximum sun exposure and coming to you immediately, and you're going to take the thermometer, the infrared thermometer, and check the temperature, you're going to be getting a false readings. High temperature is almost common symptom of all monsoon related illnesses and also in COVID-19. Your pulse, BP, toxic look of a patient, what we generally see. Hello? There's some disturbance.
Sorry, Dr. Vikrant, you can continue.
Yeah. So the pulse, BP, toxic look of a patient may not be able to differentiate one from another. Your SpO2 respiratory rate may not be helpful either. As I said earlier, your asthmatic patient, your COPD patient, chronic smokers, and COVID-19, all of them could have a problem with the SpO2 saturation. So that's going to be a problem. Skin rash can be seen in many illnesses, including so many of the monsoon-related illnesses. Hepatosplenomegaly almost seen in many of the commonly discussed conditions. Icterus again noted in many illnesses. So these are all the challenges. Will the radiology help? Definitely, we are taking help of radiology nowadays. The kind of scenario what we are facing, we are seeing the swab negative, and we are having the CT findings suggestive of COVID-19, and repeat swab is done, and that's turning out to be positive. X-ray chase is not going to be very helpful. CT chase, as I said, it can be useful, but you can have similar picture in various viral etiologies. But the thorough CORAD classification above CORAD 3 definitely helps us to differentiate between the COVID pneumonia than others. But you also need to differentiate and keep in mind the risk while getting the scans is also to be kept in mind. So I've been only talking about problems up till now. I've been briefing about the common illnesses. I've been briefing about the problems vis-a-vis the presenting symptoms, vis-a-vis the examination findings, the problem sitting in the OPD. Now, what is an answer to it? How do we overcome? There's no foolproof solution. You go to grocery store, you go to supermarket, you're going to be at risk. But we need to think about some solution. So this is what I thought bringing on to discussion for everyone's perusal. I'm sure your comments are very well welcome, including your all the questions. So I have divided into two parts. Part one, strictly patient with appointments, not seeing patients without appointment. Unless there is a dire emergency, patients are supposed to go to the emergency departments. All the hospitals have casualties, and all the hospitals have divided their casualty into fever casualty and non-COVID casualty. So there is no problem. Dire emergency, patient has to report to the casualties. So we are supposed to see patients with appointments. use a phone media to receive detailed history over the phone. So this is all done to save your time so that you can do justice to patient when the patient is sitting down in your OPD. So you can do justice to those 10 and 15 minutes what I spoke about. If they have done the lab reports, which most of the patients are doing it, ask them to WhatsApp or email you those reports. So you can go at your leisure time, you can go through the reports, you can make your notes in your mind, you can carry your own diary to have some notes on your mind. So you're ready in your mind with the detailed history of a patient, which is provided over the phone or over the WhatsApp or over the email, and you have a working diagnosis in mind before you actually see a patient. For IPD, these things really doesn't matter. Now coming to part 2, as we all know, COVID-19 can have fever, rash, myalgia, cough, sore throat, decreased appetite, vomiting, loose motion, respiratory illness, because they can even go into ARDS, they can develop toxic myocarditis, they can have a CNS involvement. We saw all this in earlier slide, but it can mimic each other. Your monsoon-related illnesses can mimic all these symptoms as well. So how to quickly differentiate in the clinical practice? I told you how to go about it as far as your OPD is concerned. So next, I'm going to give you some different salient features vis-a-vis the lab parameters. Obviously, exception is a rule. Coming to fever, this has been taught when we were a medical student. Malaria, we see tertian fever in Vivax malaria. The fever is high grade. In dengue, we see biphasic fever. Fever is high grade. Enteric fever, we get intermittent, very high grade spikes we see. Viral hepatitis, it's not specific as far as the type of fever is concerned. Chikungunya, you have a saddleback fever. In COVID-19, we see low to moderate grade fever, and you generally get fever 5 days post exposure. So this is what we've seen in the literature in our day-to-day medical practice. Coming to rash, you can see in the picture there, you can see malaria, dengue, they generally get rash with the petechial hemorrhagic spots after the platelets are down. You can get a rash in COVID-19, which you can see over the lower limb or the lateral aspect of the foot, very common in children. And enteric fever, you have this coalescing rash you can see over the chest, which is very, very common. So looking at the rash, also you have a differential diagnosis in your mind, what you are generally dealing with. People can take the pictures and send it on your WhatsApp or email you the pictures, so you know what you're doing. So the touching part is also taken care of. Test, obviously there are specific tests for the mentioned specific illnesses, like for malaria, like for dengue, for leptospira. But till we get the specific reports and specific for COVID-19, like swab test for RT-PCR for COVID-19, there are common tests which can differentiate the one illness from another. As I mentioned earlier, exception is a rule. Yes, there are. Let's see the common differences. In malaria, we see low to normal WBC count with high neutrophils, normal lymphocytes, and normal to low platelets. Complicated malaria can have thrombocytopenia, which can worsen over a period of time. I'm talking about a baseline investigation done when the patient is suffering with the illness, not talking about the complicated picture. Dengue, you can see low WBC count, you see high lymphocyte count. Remember, we see high lymphocyte count with low WBC count. Low platelets, definitely low, generally lower than what we see in leptospira or malaria. They rise in the hemoglobin to begin with as a part of hemoconcentration. Enteric fever, we see low to normal WBC with, we see monocytosis with eosinopenia. Very occasionally, we see low platelet counts. In chikungunya, high to normal WBC count. We generally see leukocytosis in chikungunya, or we can also see normal WBC count. Leptospira, definitely we see leukocytosis with neutrophilia, with low platelets count, not as low as dengue. COVID-19, we can have low to normal WBC count. We see lymphopenia. Occasionally, we also see thrombocytopenia, but this is not very common. And when we look at the CBC in COVID-19 to assess the risk, we also see something called as NL ratio. NL ratio is neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. So more than 3.13 is definitely high risk of sepsis and generally has a poor prognosis. Obviously, Dr. Shweta would be talking about particular investigations in detail but these slides are just to tell us how do we take this scientific help to differentiate one illness from another in the COVID pandemic. Jaundice, coming to jaundice, as I said, malaria, dengue, everything can have jaundice as a part of hepatopathy. When we are dealing with leptospira, it is generally of two types. What we call it as anicteric leptospira and icteric leptospira. Icteric leptospira can be severe, generally known as Wills disease, when we have involvement of the kidney, and there is a bleeding diathesis. So malaria, there is a rise in the direct bilirubin with mild elevation in the liver enzymes. We don't see significant rise in the liver enzymes. Dengue, again, rise in the total bilirubin with mild to moderate elevation in the liver enzymes, not as high as malaria. But there is a drop in albumin, which we generally don't see in malaria. Here I'm differentiating between malaria and dengue. Leptospira, when we are dealing with icteric leptospira, there is a remarkable rise in the bilirubin with mild rise in the liver enzymes, but there is a strong increase in the alkaline phosphatase. So if we remember our basics well, these basics, even if there is a jaundice which can be seen in this, but these are the particular points which we should keep in mind. Obviously, to keep in mind, exception is a rule. Viral hepatitis, there is a significant rise in the total bilirubin with very high rise in the liver enzymes. Enteric fever, you can see mild elevation in the AST in the second week of illness of the enteric fever. COVID-19, there is a more pronounced rise in the bilirubin in the second week. This is to be remembered, but significant thing what we see in COVID is rise in the bilirubin and enzymes and very high GGT. So generally we see 3 times higher the GGT in COVID-19 when we see jaundice in COVID-19. So these are the differentiating finds which we should just keep in our mind, ready to differentiate one illness from another. There are other specific tests which we be carrying out, which can be done for malaria, dengue also, but specifically in COVID era to understand the severity of the illness. We know when to do these tests. When do we expect cytokine storm in COVID-19? Now there is enough data available. So what are those specific tests? There is CRP, which can go high in all the illnesses, but pronounced rise in CRP, rising titers of CRP, LDH, interleukin-6, ferritin definitely suggest very high level of LDH, high level of interleukin-6, very high ferritin can suggest that there is a picture which is worsening, which we can see. Interleukin-6 we generally don't do, but if you're suspecting hemophagocytosis as a part of severe dengue complicated illness, we can do this test in dengue also. But typically in COVID-19, in cytokine storm, we see rise in these levels. We can also do D-dimer in COVID-19, especially old age patient with comorbidities. We've seen enough data. Patient recovering from COVID-19 and later they are presenting with myocardial infarction, pulmonary embolism, DVT, all these risk factors, because COVID-19 has a risk of thromboembolic phenomena. So we should do D-dimer, and accordingly, if patient is in the ICU, there are guidelines when to start on anticoagulation like low molecular heparin, and subsequently after receiving low molecular heparin, we put patients on antiplatelet agent like aspirin or ecosprin. We also carry out ABG. We do INR levels. Specifically, if you are suspecting pulmonary edema, we do NT-proBNP. Specific tests like HRCT, thorax, and 2D echo when relevant. All these tests, as I said, in COVID-19, there is a specific role, but in malaria, dengue, leptospira, complicated illnesses of one of these, there is a role of HRCT, thorax. If you want to see the lung injury, you want to see a toxic myocarditis, and you're seeing features of acute left ventricular failure, then echo becomes helpful. We see depressed EF, that is ejection fraction. So a mention on the treatment part, we're not going to spend much time on the treatment here. There's a specific treatment for specific monsoon related illness. Malaria, we know what do we treat with. Obviously, two drugs has to be used together. We should not treat a malaria patient with single drug, because we've seen the resistant malaria pattern. That is why we speak so much about artemisinin derivatives, which we use 2 drugs in combination. If you are using any drug for vivax malaria, we should combine doxycycline with chloroquine. So I'm not getting into details of that since we have the time limitation. Doxycycline, just to make a note, there was a nice paper which was published in March, which was published by Elsewhere also, and which has proven its own benefit in COVID-19 also. It has a lot of anti-inflammatory property. So when we treat COVID, it is what we want to do is anti-inflammatory property, antiviral property, anticoagulation property, so many things which we consider. Doxy also works as an antiviral. So in the beginning of illness, if you have symptoms like fever, significant malaise, you have chills, you have fatigability, you have body ache, you can have all these things in malaria, you can have all these things seen in COVID-19. And having gone through in detail about COVID-19, I must tell you all a small thing to remember. I don't know how many times it has been given in the social media or in the scientific media that the COVID-19 has to be treated in stages. What is important to know something about this virus or any of the virus, every virus has a phase called as autophagy. Now, at the autophagy, at the end of autophagy, there is a viral replication which starts. So drugs like ivermectin, drugs like doxycycline inhibits this viral autophagy. And if you inhibit the autophagy, you're not going to have a further viral replication and you're going to have a mild symptoms of COVID-19 and you're going to recover fast. So there is a scientific basis to use these cheaper drugs. So you should not just say that doxycycline is useless or ivermectin is useless. I would again say, and I would contradict my sentence or whatever I just said, that at the end of 7th or 8th day, I would not use ivermectin when the viral application is already set in. Then there is a role of drugs like remdesivir or other drugs which were under trial and shown some benefits like lopinavir and ritonavir, which has antiviral properties. In cytokine storm, there are specific drugs like tocilizumab which are used. Obviously, there are guidelines, there are protocols which needs to be followed for all these drugs. Also, time has evolved. We know, how to treat COVID-19. That is why the mortality is reducing. There are these drugs which are made available by the pharma companies, and we are having a better picture as far as the ICU and deaths are concerned. Also, most of the patients are managed in home quarantine now, and there is a lion's share which all of you all are taking right now in treating these asymptomatic patients. What we need to remember, there is no specific treatment. If you are picking up illness right in the beginning, ivermectin for 2 days, you can use doxycycline for 5 days, you can use any multivitamins, vitamin C, zinc in the natural form, or if you wish to give them tablets for vitamin C, zinc, there is no side effect, so I would not say no to it. Lots and lots of fluids to maintain hydration, taking care of your electrolytes. I have experienced since I am on home quarantine right now because of COVID-19. I have experienced the kind of fatigability and the malaise and the leg pains what you go through COVID-19. So all these things are of definitive use. You need to rest it out. You need to be very, very positive, and I'm sure this time phase would go and we'll have a better picture, and 2021 we would be discussing something really different. So take home message to all of y'all is going to be a clinical challenge to manage monsoon related illness and the emergencies due to ongoing pandemic, but using our clinical experience, detailed history taking, and some lab results as a scientific tool for guidance is going to be the key. Let's all get geared up for the rains. Let's not worry about rains and hope we get some breather from Corona soon. Thank you very, very, very much for your kind patience. Thank you, Dr. Vinit. And I would hand over it to Dr. Shweta.
Thank you, Dr. Vikrant. I think we can all agree that that was an illuminating presentation. Thank you once again for that beautiful presentation. I will request to all the attendees to keep asking your questions. We'll be answering all of them together at the end. Let me now introduce our second speaker without any further. Dr. Shweta Naik is the HOD of microbiology at Suburban Diagnostics, having obtained her MD in microbiology from Seth GS Medical College and KEM Hospital, and her DNB in microbiology from the National Board of Examinations, New Delhi. She has previously served as HOD of the laboratory at Jeevan Samyukta Hospital and Clinics Laboratory. She is also at the tip of the spear when it comes to the COVID-19 testing in Suburban Diagnostics. Over to you, Dr. Shweta.
Thank you for that warm introduction, Dr. Vineet. And that was an amazing presentation by Dr. Vikrant Shah. So he has highlighted that there is a close similarity of symptoms across the various types of fever. So the dilemma that clinicians face is to accurately diagnose the actual disease. While there is no crystal ball here, but the laboratory tests are an effective tool at your disposal to achieve this purpose. So I'll be just highlighting the utility of the laboratory tests for diagnosis in monsoon fevers. So basically, you will have a patient coming to you with fever. So it depending on the fever duration, you will go in for the basic test, which should include if you have a fever duration less than 7 days, CBC, ESR, your malaria antigen as well as smear, your basic LFTs, urine routine, a blood culture, dengue NS1 antigen, and an X-ray test. So basically, you're looking at the antigen-based test in the first 7 days, whereas in this after 7 days, if the patient comes to you with greater than 7 days of fever, then you have to look at the antibodies. So you are going to look at dengue antibody, lepto antibody, depending on what kind of history you're getting, what kind of clinical picture you're getting, or you can go in for a antibody test for typhoid. So the test for COVID, Dr. Vikrant has covered in detail. So these I will not go through again. I will just highlight two things that we have recently added the antigen test as well. In addition to the real-time PCR that we have been doing for so many days. So the antigen test is now available. It is a rapid point of care testing. However, the one drawback you need to keep in mind that its sensitivity is low. So while you get a patient positive on an antigen test, it is a definite positive, but you will be missing out on certain patients. So the negative is not as definitive, and you still need to reflex these patients to RT-PCR, which is the confirmatory test for COVID. So I'll be covering the test other than for COVID. The role for CBC also Dr. Vikrant has explained in detail. So the same parameters that you have to look at, like hemoglobin, RBC, your PCV, your WBC platelet counts, and this will differ according to what is the etiology of the fever that you're having. Coming to the test for malaria. So this is the basic test, the thin smear and the thick smear, always the gold standard, but the sensitivity of this test depends a lot and is variable because it depends a lot on the skill of the microscopist. So because of that, we have a malaria antigen, which is a rapid test, but it is simply not as sensitive. The PCR is now a recommended test with a good analytical sensitivity, and it also gives you a rapid species identification, which is the same that you can get in a smear. So these are the tests that you can opt for malaria. Coming to dengue, you have indirect tests like CBC, LFTs. The direct tests are basically divided into two parts. So you have an antigen test in the first 1 week, where you have a dengue NS1 rapid test and a PCR test. The PCR test is now recommended by CDC. It also detects the NS1 antigen, and within 7 days of fever onset, you will have these two tests positive. In the second week of fever, the IgM antibodies will come into picture between 5 to 30 to 90 days, and slowly the IgG titers will also go on. Now, even these antibodies can be done on a rapid test as well as an ELISA test. But the rapid test is just not as sensitive as the ELISA test. And even if you get a positive on a rapid test, it is best to be confirmed on an ELISA test. One drawback with these antibody tests is that they do have cross-reactivity to other flaviviruses, and because India has a lot of different flaviviruses also, you may get sometimes a false positive. Coming to leptospira, with all the waterlogging and the wading through water that most of the Mumbaikars do, this is also always been seen during monsoons. The screening test is based on an IgM-based assay, or a lateral flow assay. Again, the lateral flow or a rapid test has low sensitivity as compared to the ELISA. But these tests are again antibody-based, and they will come positive after 7 days of fever. In the first beginning phase, there are only 3 confirmatory tests for leptospirosis. One is the microscopic agglutination test, which is not available at most centers. It's a very complicated test to do in the lab. Obviously on biopsy you can see, but again that is a very difficult specimen to get. So the preferred test and the confirmatory test becomes the PCR based. So now I think with the COVID centers coming up, we will have a greater access to PCR all across, and it is also the recommended test by CDC. It detects the NS1 antigen. Coming to enteric fever. Enteric fever is, I would say, underdiagnosed in the laboratory because of the wrong kind of tests which are chosen. So in the beginning, in the first 7 days of fever, always and always the blood culture becomes the gold standard. You have other tests such as Vidal and typhoid test, but the antibody tests are simply not, the Vidal test is simply not recommended. It is not specific. Lot of us have a subclinical exposure to Vidal test, to typhoid, and that is why your Vidals may come false positives. It may come negative. Even culture positive patients do not do any Vidal. So the Vidal as a test is outdated and does not hold any significance unless you can show a paired serum rising. So unless you have a paired serum sample 14 days across with rising titers, the Vidal does not, a single test does not hold any significance. The rapid typhoid also detects antibodies, but the blood culture remains standard. And why is this important? This is important because the timing is essential. It should be collected as early as possible, ideally prior to the administration of antimicrobial therapy. It should be collected in an ideal manner. The contamination should be minimized because even a single bacteria going in a blood culture bottle is going to make it false positive for some skin commensal. In blood culture, one of the main parameters which allow you to get a higher positivity for blood culture is the volume. So always a paired blood culture bottle will increase your positive yield by almost 2.5 times. The volume has to be adequately diluted. So a pediatric sample has to be collected in a pediatric bottle, and a 10 ml sample of an adult has to come in an adult bottle. The blood volume changes the positivity to quite some extent. So you have a single bottle, you have a positivity of around 35%. If you have two bottles or a paired blood culture, it doubles almost to 73%. As you have more and more bottles, you can almost reach 100% diagnosis because the sensitivity of blood culture is around 1 CFU per ml, or 1 bacteria in 1 ml of blood, and that can be caught on blood culture. But again, emphasizing on the 3 pillars, the right timing, the right collection, and the right volume has to come. So what we do nowadays is this automated blood culture system, which is BacT-Alert. This is a special media which allows the bacteria to go. The CO2 released by dividing organisms will cause a color change, which is measured by the machine. And this media has special beads. So even if you have something which has a single dose of antibiotics has gone in, you can send this sample, but just make sure that the sample is taken just before the second dose of antibiotics goes in, and also that you send at least a paired blood culture so that the extra volume of blood, and in the trough period, it will allow the microbes to grow better. So coming to a case study, there was a 15-year-old girl with fever, no specific foci. Cefuroxime was given, the fever persisted. Ciprofloxacin was given, even then the fever persisted, and then blood culture was sent. Now the blood culture grew S. typhi, which is resistant to ciprofloxacin. So quinolone resistance in India is high, in particular in Bombay, I can see it is almost as high as 90%. So your quinolones do not work at all. Azithromycin, which is the second drug of choice, for one of the drug of choices for salmonella, is now showing a resistance in around 70% at our center. And even more scary is that ceftriaxone resistance has been noted in Bombay, and it is still, as of now, localized to certain pockets. So like if I get a patient from certain areas in Bombay, I know that the Salmonella typhi that is going to come in this patient is going to be ceftriaxone resistant. So in these cases, you simply don't have any options left other than going ahead with either a BL-BLA combination or meropenem. So this is why blood culture is very much important in enteric fever, especially right now, because we are seeing resistant strains in the community, and this will not resolve on oral antibiotics anymore. So once we get a blood culture positive, what we go in is for the antibiotic testing. This is also a completely automated system. What we do is we do bacterial and fungal identification on a Vitek MS2, and it gives you an MIC value. Now, how does this MIC value help in treating the patient? So the MIC values are basically that of the organism, and we have something called as a breakpoint MICs. Now the organism which is tested will give you a particular MIC value. So this is specific to the organism that is isolated from the patient's blood. The breakpoint MICs are defined by international guidelines, and they are standard for each drug-bug combination. So you will have a ceftriaxone, or you will have a ciprofloxacin, which has a particular MIC for Salmonella. It will have a particular MIC, a breakpoint MIC for E. coli. So this is specific for drug-bug combination, and this is standardized internationally. What we also give in our report is the breakpoint MIC ratio. So how does this ratio help? The further away the MIC value of the organism is from the breakpoint MIC, you will get a higher ratio. And if you get a higher ratio, it means that there is a higher probability that this drug will work in this patient. So coming to the key messages for blood culture, you have to do it for the right indication at the right timing, just before giving antibiotics. An adequate amount of blood volume has to be sent. There has to be a proper and thorough skin disinfection and the right equipment. In our case, we are going in for all automated. This gives the best results for blood culture. Always send cultures before starting antibiotics, and you have to minimize empiric treatment, especially for enteric fever. Your IDAST with the breakpoint MICs is recommended to give you the best effect for the antibiotics that we still have, which are effective for Salmonella. So when you have so many syndromes which are overlapping, so what is the, and that we do come across that this NAT is, or PCR is the recommended test of choice for so many viral infections. So what is one option that we can go in for? So one option is the FD5 or the fever syndromic approach. So this syndromic approach can be done directly on the blood sample, and it detects not only your typhoid, it also detects dengue, lepto, malaria, and chikungunya. So being a PCR test, it has a high sensitivity, and it also targets the most common monsoon illnesses that we have. So why these particular combinations? Now that we have come across, we have seen that there is fever across all these 5. There is fatigue, there is body ache, there is nausea, headache, sore throat, and skin rashes are also seen in quite a few of this. It is difficult to diagnose. This is why this entire panel can be clubbed together in a single sample, and it will help you to distinguish between these combinations and give a rapid report. So initially, the old current strategy was to do either the antigen or the antibody test, but now you can go in for a PCR in the early phases, and all these tests can be diagnosed on a single blood sample. The advantage that these kind of multiplex PCR panels have is that there is a rapid TAT. So you get a same day report, it can guide treatment, and it can help you focus whether it is a bacterial or viral infection or a parasitic infection, and obviously have a best clinical outcome. However, nucleic acid also has the disadvantage that it will also isolate a non-viable organism or asymptomatic carriers. So, and it may require reflex testing for additional PCR or additional culture. And these are the things that should be kept in mind. And coming to influenza. Now, this is something which is now become a seasonal. The swine flu was a huge thing about a few years back, and now it has turned into a seasonal virus, which we see 2 peaks. One normally comes in the monsoon, and one normally comes in December. The symptoms are also similar to that of COVID-19, fever, cough, body ache, GI symptoms. However, we still cannot underestimate this, because even in 2019, we had greater than 25,000 cases across India with more than 1,000 deaths. And we do see a lot of complications, especially in the high-risk groups. So for this also, you can go in for a RT-PCR, which is on a respiratory sample. The BAL obviously gives the best sensitivity, and you can opt for different combinations depending on what you're suspecting, whether it is influenza A or an H1N1 or A and B and H1N1. So these are the different things that we can do. Include in a season with rampant occurrence of fever, coupled with misdiagnosis and the specter of COVID overhanging us, expeditious lab testing can play a very vital role. We hope that we have been able to give you a quick overview on the different clinical features as well as the lab diagnosis, and we'll be happy to address any questions on this. Over to Dr. Vineet.
Thank you, Dr. Shweta. That was a very crisp and informative presentation. Before we start the Q&A, I have a small announcement to make. We will be collecting the details of the attendees for the certificate of attendance. If you look to the chat box, you will notice a link has been posted in the sticky message on top of the chat box. Please click this link and enter the details exactly how you want it on the certificate. Once you have entered these details and submitted a form, you will receive a certificate of attendance in your email inbox within 7 working days. Also, please note that a poll has been made live. Kindly rate our webinar in terms of content between 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest score. We'll now move on to the much awaited Q&A session. Please feel free to keep asking questions as the session goes on. So we have received quite a lot of questions. So I'll address the first question to Dr. Vikrant Shah.
Yeah.
So again, we have received quite a lot of questions based on COVID. So, and one question that's been asked is, after developing antibodies against COVID, what are the chances of getting reinfected?
So it totally depends upon your antibody. Earlier there were reports that is going to give you good sizable antibodies and you were going to be free from infection. But we've seen that there's no basis to it now. You got to be cautious till we get the vaccine. If you have antibodies which are very significant, till the time antibodies are remaining with you, you're going to have some protection. But thereafter, you're going to be as vulnerable as any other.
Okay, doctor. To Dr. Shweta, one question that's been asked again from the realm of COVID is, a negative COVID test on RT-PCR test on day 3, can it definitively exclude a diagnosis of COVID-19? Hello, Dr. Shweta?
No, the RT-PCR has inherently certain things which can, it's a test which has a sensitivity of 70%. Because there are variations in the patient, say the nasopharynx shape from the collection, to lot of variables are there. So it always, you may have a false negative. So it does not rule out even on day 3 of infection.
Thank you, Dr. Shweta. Another question that's been asked. Yeah. Another question that's been asked to Dr. Shah. This is, what is the minimum defined time of exposure to be infected with COVID-19? Is there any such time that has been defined?
No, there is no such time which is defined, but the time of exposure and amount of exposure is definitely been defined. That how much you get exposed and how much time you get exposed. But as I said, you generally develop fever after 5 days of exposure, but not necessarily nowadays. We're seeing the kind of patients who do not have fever and they're COVID-19 positive.
Another question that's being asked for about COVID-19 is, what is the ideal time to send for an RT-PCR for a COVID patient?
So if patient is symptomatic, and as Dr. Shweta earlier said, that you can have so many variables because of which the test can be negative. The RT-PCR, the swab test, the collection, the way of collection, how it has been handled. But if you are strongly suspecting, if there are classical features like high-grade fever, cough, and severe myalgia, patient has significant malaise, and you have ruled out your other clinical factors which are going into favor of COVID-19, your CBC is showing lymphopenia, your CRP is high, you should get the test done. And if the test is negative, if patient is having respiratory symptoms, even if the test is negative, I would get the CT scan done if there is hypoxia which is noted. If CT suggests anything above 4 which definitely tells me it is COVID-19, I have to repeat the swab again. and I would treat it as COVID.
Fair enough, doctor. To Dr. Shweta, there is a question when it comes to dengue antibodies. As you mentioned that there can be cross-reactivities. Can a dengue antibody cross-react with the Zika virus?
Yes, Zika virus also is a type of flavivirus, and there will be some degree of cross-reactivity seen to it in antibodies.
Okay, doctor. And there's another question that you
Dr.
mentioned.
Dr. Vinit, sorry to disturb you. Since this question has come up, may I say something on it? Since
Sure.
Please, also there. There were lots of rapid kits which were available. I'm sure Dr. Shweta is the best person to also comment on it. But I would like to take this opportunity to tell the audience that rapid tests, which are the card methods which are done in the municipal setups, are not the gold standard when it comes to dengue, or even there are tests for enteric fever. They've been doing Vidal tests. So taking help of this question, I must say that we should not rely on the card methods for dengue. There is a time period which Dr. Shweta has already defined when we do the NS1 antigen, when we do the IgM antibody for dengue, and we should always believe in ELISA method, which is more sensitive and more specific than the card method. They've been doing the card methods in government setups because they've been doing the test on a mass population. And if you have seen that report at the end, there's a footnote that every card method has to be confirmed by an ELISA method. Also, Vidal test is a useless test. One should take that out of your clinical dictionary. One should believe only in blood culture and when, how, that Dr. Shweta has already told you. But Vidal test has to be banned from our clinical practice. There's no role of Vidal test. If at all you're doing Vidal test, if you're suspecting enteric infection, we should do the Vidal test 7 days after the fever, and you should document the rising titer if at all you're doing and you do not have facilities to do other tests. But these are some things which one should remember.
That's a very good point, Dr. Vikrant Shah. Thank you for sharing that. Another question that will come across to Dr. Shweta is, as you mentioned, we can do blood cultures, and you're giving reports with the the culture and sensitivity and all. So, is it how many doses? I think somebody's missed this particular portion of the webinar, but I'll just put it out again. This question again: how many doses of antibiotics can we give before we send a blood culture, or when should we not send a blood culture after giving antibiotics?
Ideally, the blood culture has to be sent before antibiotics. Even a single dose of antibiotic can cause the blood cultures to come negative. However, if there has been a single dose which is given and you still want, the patient is still febrile, you can send the blood cultures just before the second dose is given. So you will have a TRO in the serum level of the drug. So that time you can send a blood culture. Make sure it is in an additional volume. So do not send a single bottle, send 2-3 bottles, so that added volume will help us to isolate some bacteria.
Thank you, Dr. Shweta. There are some treatment-related questions again with COVID to Dr. Vikrant Shah. There have been questions about what is the ideal time to start antivirals in COVID-19.
Right. So there are various antivirals which are there. There is this new Favipiravir, which is available, but there are guidelines which have come up now. We generally use the Favipiravir in patients with moderate disease or mild to moderate disease with comorbidities. But if you're with absolutely milder symptoms, no fever, no cough, or no other respiratory symptoms, we just don't use that. The 4th or 5th day of illness with respiratory involvement in the hospital, the patient is having COVID pneumonia, we generally start patient on remdesivir. Earlier, they were using lopinavir, ritonavir, and they were continuing that for 14 days. But after remdesivir, which is available, we are not using lopinavir, ritonavir. Also, we need to keep in mind of doing the liver function test and the uric acid before we use the Favipiravir.
Doctor, just continuing on the line of treatment questions, one person actually a couple of people have asked, is there any role for steam inhalation or saline gargles, especially in patients with very mild symptoms who need not be hospitalized?
Chinese people were swearing on steam inhalation. There's no side effect of steam inhalation, so there's no harm in taking it. I mean,
there's no evidence that it actually does any If
Yeah.
it does have that. Okay. Another question to Dr. Shweta is how sensitive is the card test when compared to the slide, malaria slide? Which is more preferable, the card or the slide?
Now, the slide is always more sensitive. It is in the hands of a good microscopist. So it depends on the skill of the microscopist to be able to pick up the malaria parasite in this blood. So in the thick smear, the sensitivity is as good as around 2 to 3 parasites. So they can be caught, but it just depends a lot on the skill of the microscopist. The rapid card method can be used in periphery where you do not have skilled microscopists, and only in that cases where you do not have access to a PCR, you do not have access to a good microscopist, only then the rapid card test will work.
Thank you, Dr. Shweta. Dr. Vikransha, one person has asked, you've shown a photograph of a rash appearing in COVID-19. Is there any particular time during which or during the timeline of the infection when these rashes are seen?
Generally, the rash appears at the second week. This is what the literature mentions.
So around the second week, basically.
Yes.
Yes. Another question again to Dr. Shah is a CORAD classification the only method to differentiate COVID from others on a CT scan?
Yes, I mean, CORAD classification is not for COVID, but anything above CORAD 3, and there are specific features which radiologists see and they can say that this is a COVID pneumonia. That is how they differentiate from one from another. Because you can have other viral pneumonias also. But nowadays they can be so certain and they say this is 100% COVID pneumonia.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. Dr. Shweta, one person has asked, should we test for influenza A and then H1N1? If influenza A is positive, can we assume that it's H1N1 because that's the more predominant variant?
So we have a combination of tests which tests for H1N1 as well as influenza A, and it will give you a report separately. So that is the preferred combination. So influenza A on its own will not cause so many complications, but again, in a if you have comorbidities, it can cause complications. But it is best to test for both together.
Dr. Shweta, probably if I have taken this question correctly, they were wanting to ask if they have influenza A or H1N1, it rules out COVID-19 or not. This was probably the question.
No, we will end up having co-infections.
Yeah.
So co-infections is going to be, it's already been a feature of the past. It's going to be with the COVID also added to the mix right now. Dr. Vikransha, another question. This is come slightly out of left field. Should G6PD be tested in every person before malaria treatment is started?
In Vivax malaria, I would certainly do it, because if I'm using chloroquine and thereafter if I'm using Primaquine, I generally do. Everyone should do G6PD. Also, in cases wherein you're not sure, you're started on treatment and patient has been reported as falciparum malaria, patient is not really responding well, and you're suspecting a mixed infection of Vivax and falciparum both, then also I would do G6PD. And also patients with gametocytes of Plasmodium falciparum, we give a single dose of Primaquine. So there is a role of G6PD for sure.
Thank you, Doctor. Just another question. There are a couple of people asking exactly what the dose of ivermectin is and how long you should give it.
We use it over 2 days, 12 milligram. We use it over 2 days time. In the beginning, that is provided in the beginning. If you're picking a COVID patient right in the beginning, no high-grade fever, severe malaise, tiredness, fatiguability, or somebody's come positive, and there are people in the house who are also turning out to be positive. So there's no harm in giving ivermectin, keeping in mind what pathophysiology I told you about the viral autophagy.
There's another person who's also asked a similar question, so I'll just club that with it. Can they start doxycycline and ivermectin immediately in an asymptomatic patient?
You can start both, yes, but it's controversial. Few people or few of our scientific colleagues would say, what is the use of using it? But technically, for a home quarantine, keeping in mind the basis behind it, there's no harm in doing that.
Thank you, Dr. Shah. Again, this is another question that one person has asked is to Dr. Shweta, is what are the tests that we can do for diphtheria?
Diphtheria. Currently, the swab is given in case you have a membrane. Culture of diphtheria bacteria is very difficult. They do not grow easily. So currently for diphtheria, I think only smear and culture are there.
Fair enough, doctor. Dr. Shah, what is the usual timeline for the development of a cytokine storm in a COVID infection?
It's varying. I mean, even we were surprised to listen from our colleagues who were in the ICU at the front line. Earlier, we used to say 5th, 6th day, then 8 to 10 day. Nowadays, they started seeing on 12, 14 day, and as late as 16 to 18 days also. So it's varying, but the predominantly people with comorbidities, with significant lung involvement, we keep an eye on them on 6th day, on 8th to 10th day, and on 12th day.
Thank you, doctor. There is another question that's been asked by a couple of people about the role of any vaccination. Oja, can you weigh in on that? Are they BCG vaccination has been touted, and then there are some people talking about MMR vaccines. Do these vaccines have any role in preventing COVID or making sure that the infection is less severe?
There are lots of trials which are going on. I would wait for those trials to come before we take the vaccination. There is a theoretical risk, like for example, if MMR, if you are talking about MMR, though it is negligible, but risk of something called as SSP to keep in mind. So I would not really do that.
Fair enough, doctor. Dr. Shweta, we have a question again. Multiple people have asked you to please explain the MIC and breakpoint MIC. Some have asked about exactly what MIC is, and many of them have asked to explain the ratio, how that can actually be used in real life.
If I can go back to that slide, just one. Okay, so the MIC values are divided into two parts. Okay, so one will be the MIC value, which is specific to the organism which we are isolating in culture from the patient. So this MIC value is the actual value of the drug which will inhibit the growth of the bacteria. The breakpoint MIC is kind of the MIC value which differentiates the value from sensitive to resistant. So basically, how do we give an organism as sensitive? So in this chart which I have put up, you can see that cefixime is sensitive, ceftriaxone is sensitive. So all these are sensitive, but the MIC values differ. So the breakpoint MICs are the values which are determined by international guidelines and which help to differentiate the bacteria from sensitive to intermediate or resistance. So if you have a report which comes like this, where you have a choice of antibiotics, how do you choose which one is the best? So in that case, to choose the most effective antibiotic from a range of antibiotics, all of which are coming out to be sensitive, you have to go in from the breakpoint MIC ratio. So what does this ratio basically tell you? So in case of amoxicillin clavulanic acid, you have a breakpoint MIC of 16. Compared to that, the MIC value is the lowest. So the difference between the two, or the ratio between the two, becomes the highest. So in this case, the amoxicillin clavulanic acid will be the most effective drug to use. So basically, it helps you choose the most effective drug when you have an array of sensitive drugs. I hope that clarifies.
Yeah, so lower the MIC and higher the breakpoint MIC and MIC ratio is what we are supposed to look at, in short.
Yes, yes.
So that will help in giving the patient the most effective antibiotic among a range of sensitive antibiotics, in short. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Dr. Shah, one question for you.
Yeah.
How long can you continue HCQS for prophylaxis of a health worker?
That we cannot really define. That COVID has to tell us. Till the time the pandemic is on, we have to continue once a week prophylaxis.
So a related question is, would you advise periodic retinal examinations for such health workers on long-term HCQS?
Yeah. We are taking once a week, and there are so many arthritis patients as a part of disease modifying agent. They've been on HCQS every single day. They recommend it doing it once in 6 months. We passed
Okay.
3 months right now, so it's not really very common to do.
So it's not time to worry about that yet.
Right.
Yes. Dr. Shah, another question to you is how would you rate the role of procalcitonin in its ability to differentiate between viral or septic or bacterial infections?
Not
In
as a
fact,
part of asymptomatic patient or milder symptom, but if I'm hospitalizing the patient, if I'm seeing that NL ratio is more than 3.13, and if I wish to use patient with IL-6 inhibitor like tocilizumab, I definitely want to rule out sepsis. So I would get the procalcitonin done, and I would repeat the procalcitonin level, but not for OPD patients to differentiate the kind of scenario what we are discussing.
thank you, doctor.
If I'm doing CRP, no need of doing procalcitonin for OPD patient. In Western population like UK, there is no PCT test which is available. They've been doing everyday CRP. In India, we have both available.
So, but either way, serial measurements are better than just a one-off measurement.
Absolutely.
Yes. Okay. So I'll just wrap this up with some of the most commonly asked questions for Dr. Shah. Because a lot of people have asked this in different varying forms, I'll just combine it to one simple question. What should be the initial line of treatment for COVID-19?
Okay. So
Especially
initial
in, I'm sorry, let me just complete, especially in asymptomatic and home quarantine patients.
So rest, hydration, and multivitamins, and that's about it. Nothing else. And ivermectin, we can give it for 2 days time. If you're symptomatic, there is a lot of role. If you're having mild coryza or mild dry cough without any breathlessness, I would also use Montelukast, since the recent paper which mentions about Montelukast. So I would use that. I would check the temperature every 3 hourly. I would check the saturation, 6-minute walk saturation every 3 to 4 hourly. That's good enough. There's nothing to get panic about.
So to keep a cool head is most important, more than anything else. Dr. Shweta, one last question. This has also been asked multiple times: is what are the advantages of RT-PCR for COVID-19 over the rapid antigen test, which has been touted by the ICMR recently?
The RT-PCR sensitivity is much higher. So when you have a patient with a lower viral load, it will get missed on the antigen test. The antigen test is very specific. So a positive by the antigen test is a definite positive, but a negative by the antigen test does not rule out COVID, especially if you have a symptomatic patient. So basically, it's a workflow in the sense you can do a point of care testing with the antigen test. If positive, you can go ahead and treat the patient as positive. If negative, you have to send that sample for the RT-PCR to confirm that the patient is negative.
I think that's all the time we have today. We've answered most of the questions that have been put to us. I would like to thank both the speakers for their phenomenal sessions and all the attendees today for joining us and for all their interesting questions as well. To the attendees, we will be emailing you a link to the recording of this webinar within 24 to 48 hours. You'll be able to watch the webinar at your convenience. Please feel free to forward the link of the recording to your colleagues who may have missed today's sessions. Till we meet again for another webinar, stay masked, stay safe. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vinith, from both of us. Thank you very much. It was very interesting and very, very entertaining indeed. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you both, and thank you to the attendees. Have a good evening.